open the door. She pushed it open herself, her hands shaking so badly she nearly lost her grip on the handle and half fell onto the wooden boardwalk. The impact sent pain shooting through her ribs where Thomas had kicked her 2 nights ago. She caught herself against a post, breathing hard through her mouth because her nose was swollen shut on one side. The late afternoon sun felt like a brand against her bruised face. She'd left everything behind in that cabin 15 miles south. Her trunk, her few possings, the carefully embroidered handkerchiefs her mother had given her before dying of consumption 3 years ago. Everything except the dress she wore, now stained with blood and trail dust, and the $3 Thomas had thrown at her before shoving her out the door. "Payment for services rendered," he'd said, laughing, "though you weren't worth even that." Evelyn straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her corset where the whalebone dug into bruised flesh. She thought she was being practical when she answered Thomas Garrett's advertisement for a wife. A widower, he'd written, seeking a respectable woman to help manage his homestead. The letters had been courteous, almost gentle. She'd imagined a weathered but kind man, perhaps lonely, certainly decent. She'd imagined wrong. The street stretched before her, rutted and worn, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean toward each other in the heat. Men stood in doorways and on corners, their conversations dying as they caught sight of her. She felt their eyes like hands, cataloging the torn sleeve, the bruises darkening her cheekbone, the split lip she kept licking because it wouldn't stop bleeding. A woman in a blue calico dress stood outside the mercantile, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth. 2 cowboys loitering near the saloon straightened, their gazes sharp with interest. An older man in a suit, the banker perhaps, or a lawyer, frowned and turned away, as if the sight of her embarrassed him. Evelyn knew what they saw, what they thought. A mail-order bride discarded before the ink dried on the marriage certificate. Used goods. A woman so flawed her own husband couldn't stand her after 3 days. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream at them that she'd tried, that she'd cooked and cleaned and done everything proper, that when Thomas came to her bed the first night, reeking of whiskey and rage, she'd submitted without complaint because that's what wives did, that she'd endured his fists and his words and his contempt because she'd had nowhere else to go. But screaming wouldn't change anything. It never did. Well, well. The voice came from her left, smooth and speculative. "Look what the stagecoach dragged in." Evelyn turned to see a man in an expensive jacket and string tie approaching, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust. He was perhaps 40, with a neat beard and calculating eyes that swept over her like she was livestock at auction. "My name's Vernon Pike," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I own the Lucky Star Saloon. You look like you could use a hot meal and a place to rest." The way he said rest made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Thank you, but I'm fine." Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Her throat still hurt where Thomas had choked her. "Don't look fine to me." Pike stepped closer, and she caught the scent of bay rum and cigar smoke. "Look like you need help. I'm a helpful man, Mrs. Garrett." The name tasted like ash, but it was still legally hers. "Ah." Pike's smile widened. "So Tom Garrett finally got himself a wife. Didn't last long, I see. Tom's got a temper, everyone knows it. Got worse after he lost his land in that poker game last spring." He paused, letting that information settle. "But his loss could be your gain. I've got rooms above the saloon, clean sheets, 3 meals a day. All you'd have to do is serve drinks, be friendly to the customers." "I don't think, of course, some girls do more than serve drinks." Pike's voice dropped to an intimate murmur. "Make real good money that way. Pretty thing like you, even banged up, could earn enough to buy a ticket anywhere you want to go. Think about it." Evelyn's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to spit in his face, to tell him she'd rather starve than set foot in his saloon. But the $3 in her pocket wouldn't buy more than a few nights' lodging and meals. She had no skills beyond basic housekeeping, no references, no friends or family within 500 miles. "She's not interested." The new voice was quiet, almost flat, but it cut through Pike's sales pitch like a blade. Evelyn turned to see a man standing a few feet away, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate light, dressed in worn denim and a faded blue shirt. Dust covered his boots and clung to his pants. He didn't look like much, Certainly not like someone who could challenge Vernon Pike, who apparently owned the biggest saloon in town. But Pike stepped back, his smile faltering. "Didn't see you there, Dawson. This is a private conversation." "Didn't look private. Looked like you were circling." The man called Dawson tilted his head slightly, and Evelyn caught a glimpse of gray eyes beneath the hat brim, steady and watchful. "Thought I'd give the lady another option." "Oh?" Pike's voice hardened. "And what option would that be?" "Honest work, fair wages, no strings." Pike laughed, a sound edged with contempt. "You offering charity now, Caleb? Gonna take in every stray that wanders into town? Thought you'd learned your lesson about that." Something flickered in Dawson's expression, too fast for Evelyn to read. "My offer stands, if she wants it. If not, that's her choice to make." He looked at Evelyn directly for the first time, and she felt the weight of that gaze. Not leering or calculating like Pike's, not pitying like the woman outside the mercantile, just assessing, like he was trying to figure out if she had any fight left in her. She wasn't sure she did, but something about the way he stood there, unhurried and unbothered by Pike's sneering or the gathering crowd of onlookers, made her want to find out. "What kind of work?" Her voice still sounded wrecked, but she forced the words out clearly. "I've got a ranch about an hour's ride north. Run cattle, some horses. My housekeeper's sister took sick last month and she left to care for her. Haven't found a replacement yet." He paused, considering. "You know how to cook? Clean? Mend?" "Yes." Basic housekeeping she could do. She'd been doing it since she was 12. "Then the job's yours if you want it. Room and board plus $15 a month. Sundays off. You keep to yourself, do your work, we'll get along fine." $15 a month was a decent wage, more than fair for a woman with no references and visible proof of failure written across her face. It was also far less than Pike was probably offering, though his opportunity came with expectations that made her stomach turn. "And the strings?" Evelyn asked, because men like Pike had taught her that nothing came without a cost. Dawson's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I need a housekeeper." "You need work. That's the whole transaction. You do the job, you get paid, you're free to leave whenever you want. I'm not looking for anything else." "Caleb Dawson, the righteous hermit," Pike said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Living out there alone, nursing his grief and his grudges. You think working for him will be better than working for me? He'll work you half to death and bore you the other half. Man barely speaks 10 words in a week." "Better silent than slimy," Dawson said without heat. He looked at Evelyn again. "Your choice, ma'am. But decide quick. I've got supplies to load, and I'd like to be home before full dark." Evelyn looked between the two men, Pike with his oily charm and expensive clothes, Dawson with his dust and his quiet and his eyes that didn't strip her naked just by looking. Behind them, the town watched and waited, ready to judge whatever choice she made. She'd made one terrible choice 3 months ago when she'd answered Thomas Garrett's advertisement. Every instinct she had left was screaming at her not to trust another man, not to put herself in another isolated place where no one could hear her scream. But she'd screamed plenty in Thomas's cabin, and it hadn't helped. And something about the way Dawson had said, "your choice," like he actually meant it, like he'd walk away without argument if she said no, made her think maybe, just maybe, he was different. Or maybe she was a fool twice over. Either way, she was out of options. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice stronger now. "Mr. Dawson," Pike's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. When you change your mind, and you will, don't come crying to me." "Won't be necessary," Dawson said. He gestured toward a wagon hitched outside the general store, loaded with sacks of flour and other supplies. "You need anything from inside before we go?" Evelyn thought about what she needed. A change of clothes that didn't smell like blood and fear, soap, perhaps a comb to work the tangles from her hair. But she had $3 to her name and no idea how long it would take to earn more. "No," she said. "I'm ready." Dawson nodded once, then turned and walked toward the wagon without looking back to see if she'd follow. After a moment, Evelyn did, her feet dragging with exhaustion and pain. She was aware of the whispers starting up behind her, the speculation and scandal and judgment. Let them talk. She'd survived worse than gossip. The wagon seat was high, and climbing up to it sent arranging her torn skirts as modestly as she could. Dawson swung up beside her with easy grace, gathering the reins. "One more thing," he said, not looking at her. "You've got injuries that need tending. There's a doctor in town, Doc Brennan. I can wait if you need to see him first." The kindness in the offer made Evelyn's throat tight. "I don't have money for a doctor." "I'll cover it. Take it out of your first month's wages if you want." She should say yes. Her ribs might be cracked, and her nose felt wrong, like maybe Thomas had broken something when he'd backhanded her. But the thought of being touched right now, even by a doctor, even for healing, made her want to crawl out of her skin. "Maybe later," she whispered. I need to be away from here." Dawson studied her for a long moment, then clicked his tongue and set the horses moving. The wagon lurched forward, and Evelyn gripped the edge of the seat to keep from swaying. As they rolled down the main street, she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the faces tracking their departure. They passed the last building and turned onto a rutted track heading north into open country. The land stretched out in all directions, brown grass and scattered sage beneath a sky so vast it made Evelyn feel small and exposed. The late afternoon sun slanted golden across the hills, beautiful in a stark way that matched nothing in her experience. She'd grown up in St. Louis, in a narrow house on a narrow street where the buildings pressed close and you could hear your neighbors through the walls. Even after her mother died and she'd gone to live with her aunt, she'd been surrounded by people and noise in the dense, cluttered life of the city. This emptiness felt like drowning in air. "You from back east?" Dawson asked, his voice startling her out of her thoughts. "St. Louis." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I came out here to marry Thomas Garrett. We corresponded for 3 months. He seemed different in his letters." Most people do. There was no judgment in Dawson's tone, just a statement of fact. "Have you known him long, Thomas?" "Long enough to know his reputation." Dawson guided the horses around a deep rut. "He drinks heavy, gambles worse, and takes losing personal. Lost his homestead claim in a card game 6 months back, been living in a line shack on borrowed land ever since. Probably figured a wife might help him look respectable enough to get credit again." "He never mentioned any of that in his letters," Evelyn said bitterly. "He wrote about building a future, about wanting a partner. Men like Thomas want a servant they can use without paying wages. When you didn't fix all his problems the first day, he decided you weren't worth the trouble." Dawson paused. "Some men think women are either saints who'll save them or whores who'll ruin them. Can't imagine we're just people trying to get by, same as them." The observation was so unexpected, so quietly perceptive, that Evelyn found herself looking at him properly for the first time. His profile was weathered, his jaw shadowed with a few days' stubble, his nose slightly crooked like it had been broken and healed wrong. Not a handsome face exactly, but a lived-in one. Lines bracketed his mouth and creased the corners of his eyes, from squinting in the sun probably, but they gave him a look of perpetual weariness that seemed bone deep. "How old are you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's rude." 34, Dawson said without offense. "You?" 23. "You married before Thomas?" "No." She hesitated, then added, "My mother died when I was 20. I lived with my aunt after that, but she had 6 children of her own, and one more mouth was a burden. When Thomas's advertisement appeared in the paper, she encouraged me to answer it, said it was a good opportunity, a chance at my own home. And now you're right back where you started, dependent on strangers, no home of your own." The words could have been cruel, but Dawson said them matter-of-factly, like he was just describing the situation as it was. Evelyn found that easier to bear than sympathy would have been. "Yes," she said simply. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the jingle of harness, and the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for how Evelyn felt inside, bruised and hollow and scraped raw. "The ranch is called the Broken Bell," Dawson said eventually. "About 600 acres, decent grazing. I run maybe 200 head of cattle, plus a dozen horses. It's just me working the place right now, which means I'm behind on everything. The house needs cleaning, I've been eating out of cans for a month, and I've got mending piled up that would take a week to get through. I can do all of that, Evelyn said, eager to prove she could earn her keep. I'm a good cook. I can make a dollar stretch. And I know how to mend anything short of leather tack. Good. Dawson glanced at her. The work's honest, and I expect it done properly. But I won't push you until you're healed. First few days, just do what you can manage. After that, we'll settle into a routine. The pragmatism in his voice steadied something in Evelyn's chest. This was a transaction, simple and clear. She would work, he would pay her, and there would be no expectations beyond that. No pretense of romance or rescue, no debts that couldn't be calculated in dollars and tasks completed. She could manage that, maybe. The land began to change as they traveled north, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. A creek appeared to their left, its water running clear over smooth stones. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Wildflowers, maybe, or just the clean smell of places where people didn't crowd together. As the sun touched the horizon, Dawson pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings sat in a shallow valley, nestled against the side of a hill. There. That's home. Evelyn leaned forward, studying the ranch. The main house was a simple structure, one story with a covered porch running along the front. The wood looked weathered but sound, and smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray thread. Beyond the house stood a barn, a chicken coop, several corrals, and a few smaller outbuildings she couldn't identify in the fading light. It looked sturdy, practical, lonely. They rolled into the yard, and Dawson pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch. He climbed down stiffly, like he'd been in the saddle too long, and came around to offer Evelyn his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His palm was calloused and rough, his grip firm but careful, like he knew she was hurt and was trying not to cause more pain. He helped her down, then released her immediately, and stepped back. Front door's open, he said. Go on in and pick whichever bedroom suits you. There's two besides mine, one upstairs, one down. I'll bring your things. He stopped, seeming to remember she didn't have any things. Right. Well, there's probably some old clothes in the chest in the upstairs room. My wife's things. They might fit. The words hung in the air, awkward and heavy. Evelyn looked at him sharply. You're married? Widowed. 4 years now. I'm sorry. Dawson shrugged, a gesture that said he'd heard those words too many times to find comfort in them anymore. Go on inside. I'll tend the horses and bring in the supplies. Then we'll see about supper. Evelyn walked slowly to the porch, every step a reminder of her battered body. The front door opened with a creak, and she stepped into a dim interior that smelled of dust and wood smoke and loneliness. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area combined. A large fireplace dominated one wall, a cook stove stood in the corner, and a scarred table with 4 mismatched chairs occupied the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes and cooking implements and a few books. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust that suggested weeks of neglect. 2 doors opened off the main room, one to her left, one to her right. A narrow staircase led upward into darkness. Evelyn found a lamp on the table, managed to get it lit with shaking hands, and carried it upstairs. The upper floor was a single large room under the eaves, with a slanted ceiling and a small window at each end. A bed frame stood against one wall, its mattress rolled up and tied. A dresser and a wooden chest completed the furnishings. Evelyn set the lamp on the dresser and opened the chest. Inside, carefully folded, she found women's clothing, dresses in calico and wool, petticoats, stockings, a nightgown. Everything was years out of fashion but clean and well made. At the bottom of the chest lay a quilt in a wedding ring pattern, the stitching so fine it must have taken months to complete. She lifted out the nightgown, holding it against herself. The woman who'd worn this had been taller than Evelyn and broader through the shoulders, but the fabric was soft, worn to gentleness by many washings, and the thought of clean clothes against her skin was almost overwhelming. Footsteps sounded below, followed by the thud of heavy sacks being set down. Dawson's voice drifted up. There's a pump out back if you want to wash up. Water's cold, but it's clean. I'll get a fire going and heat some for a proper bath if you'd rather wait. Evelyn made her way downstairs carefully, the nightgown clutched in her hands. Dawson was stacking supplies on the shelves, his movements efficient and practiced. He glanced at her, then at the nightgown, and something complicated crossed his face. "Those fit all right?" he asked. "I think so. Thank you for letting me use them." "No sense in them sitting empty." He turned back to the shelves. Sarah would have wanted them used. She wasn't precious about things, just about people. The name hung in the air between them. Sarah, who had made the quilt in the wedding ring pattern and worn these dresses and lived in this lonely house with a man who barely spoke. Evelyn wondered what had happened to her, how she'd died, whether she'd been happy here, but asking felt like prying, and Evelyn was too tired to navigate those waters tonight. "I'll wash up," she said instead, "and then, if you show me where everything is, I can start supper." Dawson looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "You just got here. You're half dead on your feet. I can manage supper. You hired me to cook and keep house. I'd like to start earning my keep." "You'll earn it soon enough." His voice was firm. "Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the routine." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to prove she was worth the $15 a month and the room and the borrowed clothes. But her body was screaming at her, every bruise and ache demanding attention, and the thought of just sitting down and not being afraid made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." She found the pump out back, worked the handle until water gushed cold and clear into the basin beneath. She stripped off her ruined dress, standing in her chemise and petticoat, and washed herself as thoroughly as she could bear, hissing when the cold water hit her bruises. The blood came off her face, the dust from her hair. She scrubbed until her skin felt raw and new. When she returned inside wearing the borrowed nightgown, Dawson had coffee brewing and beans heating on the stove. He'd set out 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 spoons. The ordinariness of it, the domestic simplicity, made Evelyn's chest tighten. They ate in silence. The beans were bland but hot, the coffee strong and bitter. Evelyn forced herself to eat slowly even though she was starving, her stomach too unsettled for anything resembling appetite. When they finished, Dawson collected the dishes and set them in the basin. "I'll wash up," he said. "You should sleep. Mornings start early here." Evelyn stood, swaying slightly. "Mr. Dawson, why did you help me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his back to her as he pumped water over the dishes. "Because you needed help," he said finally, "and because I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. Someone gave me a chance when I needed one. Figured I'd pay it forward." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. Evelyn nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Well, thank you. I won't make you regret it." "See that you don't." She climbed the stairs slowly, her body one massive ache. The bed upstairs had no sheets, but she spread the wedding ring quilt over the bare mattress and lay down on top of it, too exhausted to do more. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, scattered like salt across black velvet. The night sounds filtered in, crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, wind in the pines. And beneath it all, the sound of Caleb Dawson moving quietly through his house, washing dishes and banking the fire and living his solitary life that she'd now become part of. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Work, probably. Silence. The slow process of healing, if healing was even possible. But for the first time in 3 days, maybe in 3 months, maybe in the 3 years since her mother died, she felt something other than fear. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she might survive this after all. Evelyn woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and pale gray light filtering through the window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, slanted and unfamiliar, and the air smelled of pine and dust instead of Thomas's sour sweat and whiskey breath. Then memory crashed back. The stagecoach, the town, Vernon Pike's oily smile, Caleb Dawson's quiet offer. She sat up slowly, cataloging her injuries in the morning light. Her ribs screamed with every breath. Her face felt swollen and hot, the bruises probably darker now than they'd been yesterday. Her throat ached where Thomas had choked her, and when she touched it gently, she could feel the shape of his fingers still pressed into her skin. But she was alive. And she was here, wherever here was, instead of in Pike's saloon or back in Thomas's cabin or dead in a ditch somewhere. That was something. She rose carefully and dressed in one of Sarah Dawson's calico dresses, a faded blue that hung loose on her smaller frame but was blessedly clean. There was a mirror above the dresser, small and speckled with age, and Evelyn made herself look at her reflection. The woman staring back was almost unrecognizable. Her left eye was swollen half shut, ringed with purple and green bruising. Her lip was split and crusted with dried blood. Her cheekbone bore an ugly mark the shape of Thomas's knuckles. Her nose, mercifully, didn't look broken despite how it felt. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been beaten and discarded. Evelyn turned away from the mirror and made her way downstairs, her hand gripping the railing for support. The main room was empty, but the cook stove was warm and coffee sat brewing in the pot. Through the window, she could see Dawson crossing the yard toward the barn, a bucket in each hand. She poured herself coffee and stood at the window, sipping the bitter liquid and watching him work. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, no wasted effort, everything purposeful. He disappeared into the barn, emerged a few minutes later empty-handed, then headed toward the chicken coop. Evelyn set down her cup and surveyed the kitchen. True to what Dawson had said, the place was a mess. Not dirty exactly, but neglected. Dust coated every surface. Dishes were stacked haphazardly on the shelves. The floor needed sweeping. The windows were so grimy they barely let light through. She could fix this. This she knew how to do. She found a broom in the corner and started sweeping, moving carefully to avoid jarring her ribs. The rhythmic motion was soothing, familiar, something to focus on besides the ache in her body and the chaos in her mind. She swept the entire main floor, then filled a bucket with water from the pump and began washing the windows. She was halfway through the second window when the front door opened and Dawson stepped inside, carrying a basket of eggs. He stopped when he saw her, his expression shifting to something that might have been disapproval. "Thought I told you to rest," he said. "I've rested enough." Evelyn wrung out her rag and moved to the next window. "You hired me to keep house. I'm keeping it. You can barely stand upright." "I can stand well enough to clean a window." Dawson set the egg basket on the table with more force than necessary. "You're injured. You should be in bed, not scrubbing my floors." "I've worked through worse than a few bruises." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the defensiveness of someone who'd learned that showing weakness only invited more pain. Dawson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I'm sure you have, but you don't have to prove anything to me. The job's yours whether you work today or not." Evelyn lowered the rag, her throat tight. "I need to be useful. If I'm not useful, then—" She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. Then what? Then she was just another burden, another mouth to feed, another woman taking up space she hadn't earned. "Then what?" Dawson asked quietly. "Then there's no reason for you to keep me here." The admission felt like exposing a wound. "I know how this works. I've been someone's obligation my whole life. My mother's, my aunt's, Thomas's. The moment I stopped being useful, they didn't want me anymore. So I need to work. I need to earn my place." Dawson studied her with those steady gray eyes, and Evelyn had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through to all the scared, broken parts of her she was trying to hide. "You earn your place by showing up," he said finally. "By trying, not by working yourself into the ground when you can barely walk. I told you yesterday, the job's yours. I'm not going to throw you out because you took a day to heal. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm worth keeping." "No," he agreed. "And you don't know me. Don't know if this place is worth staying. So how about we both take it one day at a time and see how it goes?" The simplicity of it, the lack of expectations or demands beyond basic mutual decency, made Evelyn's eyes burn. She blinked hard and turned back to the window, scrubbing at a stubborn spot to hide the fact that her hands were shaking. "Fine," she said. "One day at a time, but I'm still cleaning these windows." She heard what might have been a sigh behind her, then footsteps retreating. "Suit yourself, but if you need to stop, stop. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." After he left, Evelyn finished the windows, then moved on to washing the dishes and organizing the shelves. Every movement hurt, but the pain was almost welcome. Something concrete to focus on, a distraction from the thoughts that kept circling in her mind like buzzards. She'd trusted Thomas, believed his letters, his promises of partnership and respect, and she'd been wrong in the most brutal way possible. Now she was trusting Caleb Dawson, a man she'd known for less than a day, who'd offered her shelter and work without asking for anything in return. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was foolish, that men didn't help women without expecting payment of some kind, that she was setting herself up for another disaster. But what choice did she have? She could go back to Bitter Creek and accept Vernon Pike's offer, sell herself piece by piece until there was nothing left. She could try to find work elsewhere, though with no references and a face full of bruises that marked her as trouble. Or she could stay here and hope that Dawson meant what he said. One day at a time. She could manage that. Maybe. By the time Dawson returned for the midday meal, Evelyn had cleaned the kitchen, organized the pantry, and started a pot of stew with vegetables and salt pork she'd found in the larder. She'd also found a sewing basket and mended 3 of his shirts that had been sitting in a pile with torn seams and missing buttons. Dawson stood in the doorway staring at the transformed kitchen, his hat in his hands. "You've been busy." "You said you were behind on everything. I thought I'd make a start." Evelyn stirred the stew, not looking at him. "It'll be ready to eat in about an hour." "Smells good." He hung his hat on a peg by the door and washed his hands in the basin. "Thank you." The gratitude in his voice was so genuine, so lacking in expectation of further service, that Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen slightly. They ate together at the scarred table, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been the night before. The stew was simple but hot, and Dawson ate like a man who'd been living on beans and hardtack for too long. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. The appreciation was clear in the way he went back for seconds, then thirds. "My wife used to make stew like this," he said eventually, soaking up the last of the broth with a piece of bread. "She'd put in whatever we had on hand, and somehow it always tasted like something special." It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah without being prompted, and Evelyn sensed an opening. "How long were you married?" 6 years, met her in Colorado, brought her back here when I claimed this land." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands tightened slightly on his spoon. "She died in childbirth, the baby too, boy. He lived about an hour." The words were spare, almost brutal in their simplicity, but the pain beneath them was vast. Evelyn felt it like a presence in the room, heavy and old. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but not knowing what else to offer. "It was 4 years ago, still feels like yesterday sometimes." Dawson pushed back from the table and stood, collecting the dishes. "Doctor said she was built too narrow, that pregnancy was dangerous for her. But we wanted a family, she wanted it, so we tried." He paused at the basin, his back to Evelyn. "Turned out wanting something isn't enough to make it happen." Evelyn thought about her own wants. A home, a partner, a life that felt secure. She'd wanted those things desperately, and wanting them had led her straight into Thomas Garrett's fists. "No," she agreed quietly, "it isn't." Dawson washed the dishes in silence, and Evelyn rose to help him dry despite the protest of her ribs. They worked side by side, not speaking, and the quiet felt almost peaceful. That afternoon, while Dawson worked on mending a fence in the south pasture, Evelyn continued her campaign against the house's neglect. She swept the upstairs room that would be hers, beat the dust from the mattress, made the bed properly with sheets she found in a trunk. She scrubbed the floors, washed the curtains, and tackled the accumulation of grime that came from a man living alone with no one to answer to but himself. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, she was exhausted and hurting. But the house looked better than it had in months, maybe years. Dawson came in just as she was setting out supper, cornbread and the last of the stew, plus coffee strong enough to strip paint. He stopped in the doorway again, looking around with an expression that might have been wonder. "Place looks different," he said. "It looks clean," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference between different and clean." "Haven't seen it this clean since Sarah died." He washed up and sat at the table, accepting the plate she handed him. "You didn't have to do all this in one day." "I needed to stay busy." Evelyn sat across from him, moving stiffly. Her ribs were screaming now, punishment for pushing too hard, but she'd accomplished something. That mattered. They ate in companionable silence until Dawson said, "There's a soaking tub in the lean-to behind the house. If you want, I can heat water for a bath after supper. Might help with the soreness. The offer was practical, almost clinical, but Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. The thought of undressing, of being that vulnerable even with a door between them, made her skin crawl with anxiety. Dawson seemed to read her hesitation. I'll be in the barn doing evening chores. You'll have privacy. Just knock on the barn door when you're done and I'll come drain the tub. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but hot water helps bruises heal faster, and you've got plenty of those. He stood and started clearing the table. Consider it part of your recovery. Doctor's orders, except without the doctor. Evelyn wanted to argue, but the thought of hot water against her aching body was too tempting to resist. All right, thank you. An hour later, she was submerged in the soaking tub, water heated to just below scalding, and for the first time in days, she felt something like relief. The heat seeped into her bruised muscles, loosening the knots of tension she'd been carrying. She stayed until the water began to cool, then dried herself carefully and dressed in the borrowed nightgown. When she knocked on the barn door, Dawson emerged without comment and went to drain the tub while she climbed the stairs to her room. She was asleep before her head fully settled on the pillow, the wedding ring quilt pulled up to her chin. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Evelyn woke early, made coffee and breakfast, cleaned whatever part of the house or yard needed attention. Dawson worked the ranch, mending fences, tending cattle, breaking horses, fixing the 1,000 small things that went wrong on 600 acres of land. They ate meals together, speaking little but sharing the space with growing ease. On the 4th day, Evelyn ventured outside to tackle the vegetable garden that had gone to seed behind the house. She was on her knees pulling weeds when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider approaching the house. The visitor was a woman, perhaps 50, dressed in a practical split skirt and man's shirt, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. She dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback and tied her horse to the porch rail. "You must be the new housekeeper," the woman said, her sharp eyes taking in Evelyn's fading bruises with a single comprehensive glance. "I'm Margaret Brennan. My husband's the doctor in Bitter Creek, but I run a small ranch about 10 miles east. Heard Caleb hired someone." Evelyn stood slowly, brushing dirt from her borrowed dress. "Evelyn Harper. Mrs. Harper." "Garrett, I heard." Margaret's expression was neutral, but there was sympathy in her eyes. "Also heard your husband wasn't much of a husband. Glad you got away from him." The bluntness was startling, but not unwelcome. Evelyn found she was tired of polite fiction, of people pretending not to see what was written all over her face. "Thank you," she said simply. Margaret glanced toward the barn where Dawson was working. "Caleb's a good man. Had some hard years, but he's solid. Treats his animals better than most people treat their families. You'll be safe here." "I'm beginning to see that." "Good." Margaret's tone turned brisk. "I brought some things, figured you might need them. Women's necessities, some salve for those bruises, a couple of dresses that might fit better than Sarah's old ones. They're in my saddlebag." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "Didn't have to? Wanted to. We look out for each other out here. Too spread out not to." Margaret retrieved a cloth bag from her saddle and handed it to Evelyn. "There's also some herbs in there. Make a tea from the ones wrapped in brown paper. Helps with pain and inflammation. The ones in white paper help you sleep if you're having nightmares." The casual acknowledgement that of course Evelyn would be having nightmares made her eyes burn. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan." "Margaret, and you're welcome." The older woman paused, then added more gently, "It gets better. Not easy and not fast, but it does get better. You just have to give it time." Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. Margaret patted her shoulder once, firm and brief, then remounted and rode off with a wave toward Dawson, who'd emerged from the barn to watch. That night, Evelyn made tea from the brown paper herbs and sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. The tea was bitter but soothing, and she felt the constant ache in her ribs ease slightly as she sipped it. Dawson joined her after finishing his chores, carrying his own cup of coffee. He settled into the other chair with a sigh that spoke of a long day's work. "Margaret bring you supplies?" he asked. "Yes, she was very kind. Margaret's good people. Her and Doc Brennan both. They help where they can." He sipped his coffee. "She say anything else?" "That you're a good man, that I'll be safe here. Dawson made a non-committal sound. Margaret's got opinions about everything. Sometimes they're even right. Evelyn smiled slightly, the expression pulling at her healing lip. She seems like the kind of person who's usually right. Unfortunately, Dawson was quiet for a moment, then said, "You settling in all right? Everything you need?" "Yes, more than I expected, honestly." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "You've done good work this week. House looks better than it has in years. Meals are excellent. You're earning your keep and then some." The praise made Evelyn's chest warm. "Thank you. Just stating facts." Dawson stood, draining the last of his coffee. "I'm heading into town tomorrow for supplies. You need anything? Make a list. And if you want to come along, you're welcome. Or you can stay here if you'd rather." The thought of going back to Bitter Creek, of facing the stares and whispers and Vernon Pike's knowing smirk, made Evelyn's stomach turn. But the thought of staying here alone, of being isolated with no one in shouting distance, brought a different kind of anxiety. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair enough. Let me know in the morning." He collected both cups and went inside, leaving Evelyn alone with the gathering darkness and the sound of crickets in the grass. She stayed on the porch until full dark, wrapped in one of Sarah's old shawls, watching stars appear one by one in the vast sky. The quiet was still unsettling, so different from the city's constant noise, but it was beginning to feel less like drowning and more like breathing room. The next morning, she told Dawson she'd stay at the ranch. He accepted this without comment, gave her a list of simple chores to occupy the day, and drove off in the wagon just after dawn. Evelyn worked through the morning, washing linens and hanging them to dry in the sun, weeding the garden, feeding the chickens. The tasks were mundane but satisfying, and she fell into an almost meditative rhythm. She was beating dust from a rug when she heard a horse approaching and looked up to see a rider. A man, alone, coming from the south at an easy trot. Her first instinct was to run inside and bolt the door, but she forced herself to stay put, the rug beater gripped tight in her hands, and waited. The rider was young, maybe 25, dressed in range clothes that had seen better days. He had an open, friendly face and a ready smile that he turned on Evelyn as he reined in his horse. "Morning, ma'am," he called. "Is Caleb around?" "He's gone to town. Should be back this afternoon." Evelyn kept her voice level, her posture straight despite her hammering heart. "Ah, that's all right. I'm Ben Morrison from the Double M Ranch about 20 miles west. Just wanted to talk to Caleb about buying one of his horses. Heard he's got a good mare ready to sell." "I can tell him you stopped by. Appreciate it." Ben's eyes dropped to the bruises on Evelyn's face, faded now to yellow and green but still visible. His smile faded. "You doing all right, ma'am? Those look like they hurt." "I'm fine," Evelyn said automatically. "Right." Ben's tone suggested he didn't believe her but was too polite to press. "Well, you tell Caleb I'll come back in a few days to talk horses. And ma'am, you need anything, help or someone to ride for the law or just another person around, the Double M's not that far. My ma would be happy to have you visit." The offer was genuine, without any undertone of threat or expectation, and it made Evelyn's throat tight again. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." "Ben, please." He tipped his hat. "You take care now." He rode off, and Evelyn stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. Then she went inside and made herself tea from Margaret's herbs, her hands shaking slightly with the aftermath of fear that hadn't materialized into danger. When Dawson returned that afternoon, wagon loaded with supplies, she told him about Ben's visit while helping him unload. "Ben's good people," Dawson said, hefting a sack of flour. "His family's been in the territory longer than most. If he said you could count on them, you can. Everyone here seems—" Evelyn searched for the right word. "Decent. Some are, some aren't." Dawson set down the flour and reached for another sack. "But the good ones tend to look out for each other. It's how we survive out here." "Is that why you helped me? Because it's how people survive?" Dawson paused, a sack of grain balanced on his shoulder. "I helped you because you needed help, and I could give it. Same reason Margaret brought you supplies. Same reason Ben offered his family's support. Out here, we're all one bad winter or one piece of bad luck away from disaster. Makes you think different about charity. He carried the grain inside, and Evelyn followed with a smaller box of dry goods. It's different from the city, she said. Back there, everyone's so close together, but no one really helps. Here, people are miles apart, but they show up anyway. Distance makes you value the neighbors you've got, Dawson said. Can't afford to burn bridges when the next bridge is 20 miles away. Over the next week, Evelyn's bruises faded from purple to yellow to a barely there shadow. Her ribs stopped screaming with every breath and settled into a dull ache that was manageable. She grew stronger, more confident in her movements, less afraid of every sound and shadow. The house continued to transform under her care. She made curtains from fabric Dawson had brought from town, planted new vegetables in the garden, organized the barn and the tack room with ruthless efficiency. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to expect Dawson for meals, which chores needed doing daily versus weekly, how to read the weather and the shape of the clouds over the mountains. She also learned about Dawson himself, in small increments. He wasn't much for talking, but he was consistent, reliable, and surprisingly gentle with everything he touched. Animals, tools, even the way he set dishes on the table. He never raised his voice, never moved suddenly, never crowded her space. It was like he understood that she was still half wild with fear, and he was giving her room to settle. 2 weeks after her arrival, Evelyn was in the garden harvesting early peas when she heard the rattle of a wagon and looked up to see an unfamiliar rig approaching. The driver was a heavy-set man in a dusty suit, alone, and something about the set of his shoulders made Evelyn's instincts scream danger. She straightened slowly, the basket of peas forgotten, and watched as the wagon pulled to a stop in the yard. The man climbed down with a grunt and looked around until his gaze landed on her. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a sneer that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "If it isn't the runaway bride. Heard you'd ended up out here playing house with the hermit." Evelyn recognized him now, one of the men who'd been outside the saloon the day she arrived in Bitter Creek, watching her with calculating eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Name's Jack Yates. I'm a friend of your husband's. Tom asked me to check on you, make sure you're being treated proper." His smile was all teeth, no warmth. "He's worried about you, you know. Feels bad about the misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding." Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. "And he's not my husband anymore. Now, legally speaking, he is. Marriage is binding, little lady. Can't just run off because you had a spat." Yates took a step closer, and Evelyn held her ground even though every instinct told her to run. "Tom wants you to come home. Says he's willing to forgive you for making such a fuss." "No." "No?" Yates's expression darkened. "You don't get to say no. You're his wife, his property, legally, and he wants you back." She said no. Dawson's voice came from behind Yates, flat and cold. Evelyn looked past Yates to see Dawson standing near the barn, a rifle held loose in his hands, not pointed at anyone but very much present. Yates turned, his smile returning but strained now. "Dawson, didn't see you there. This is a private matter between a man and his wife. His former wife, who doesn't want to see him. That makes it not a matter at all." Dawson's eyes were ice gray and steady. "You can ride back to town and tell Tom Garrett that Mrs. Harper is employed here legally, staying of her own free will, and he's got no claim on her. The law says different. The law says a man can't beat his wife half to death and then demand she come back for more. Sheriff Halstead would be real interested to hear about those bruises she showed up with." Dawson's voice didn't rise, but there was steel in it now. "You want to test that, Jack? Want to ride into town and see whose story the sheriff believes?" Yates's jaw worked, his face reddening. "Tom's not going to like this. Tom can come talk to me himself if he has a problem, but he sends you or anyone else out here to harass Mrs. Harper again. We're going to have a different kind of conversation." The rifle shifted slightly, still not pointed at Yates, but the implication clear. For a long moment, Yates just stood there, weighing his options. Then he spat in the dust and climbed back onto his wagon. "You're making a mistake, Dawson, both of you." "Wouldn't be my first." Dawson watched as Yates turned the wagon and drove off, not lowering the rifle until the wagon was out of sight over the ridge. Then he walked to where Evelyn stood, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes. Thank you." Her voice came out thin, breathless. I didn't expect Thomas to send someone. Men like Thomas don't let go easy. They see it as losing, and they can't stand to lose. Dawson leaned the rifle against the fence and turned to face her fully. He might try again, might come himself next time. You need to be ready for that. I don't know how to be ready. The admission felt like failure. I don't know how to fight him. You don't fight him. You outlast him. Dawson's expression was serious. Men like that, they're counting on you being afraid, being alone, having nowhere to go. But you're not alone. You've got me and Margaret and Ben Morrison's family and anyone else in this territory who's got a shred of decency. Thomas can bluster all he wants, but he can't make you go back. He said I'm his property, legally. Legally, marriage gives a man certain rights, but it doesn't give him the right to abuse, and it doesn't mean you've got no recourse. Dawson paused. If it comes to it, we can talk to Sheriff Halstead. He's a fair man. Or we can see about getting the marriage annulled, though that'd mean a trip to the county seat and some legal fees. The thought of legal battles and official proceedings made Evelyn tired, but the alternative, going back to Thomas, submitting to more beatings, more degradation, was impossible. I'll think about it, she said. You do that. Meanwhile, you stay alert. Don't go far from the house alone, and if anyone shows up when I'm gone, you get inside and bar the door. There's a shotgun in the corner by the fireplace. You know how to use one? No. Then I'll teach you. He picked up the rifle again. Tomorrow, after chores. Can't have you defenseless out here. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jack Yates's words. His property, legally. The phrase circled in her mind like a vulture, a reminder that the law didn't care much about bruises or fear or a woman's right to refuse. But Dawson had stood up for her, had put himself between her and danger without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, had offered to help her fight, to teach her to defend herself. Nobody had ever done that before. Not her aunt, who'd been eager to marry her off and reduce the burden. Not her mother, who'd loved her but been too sick to protect her. Not anyone. Evelyn pulled the wedding ring quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, and for the first time since leaving Thomas's cabin, she let herself imagine a future that didn't involve running, a future where she stayed, where she learned to shoot and to stand her ground, where she built something resembling a life. It seemed impossible. But then again, 2 weeks ago surviving another day had seemed impossible, and here she was, still breathing, still trying. Maybe that was enough. Morning came cold and clear, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Evelyn woke before dawn and dressed quickly, her breath misting in the chilly air. Downstairs, she found Dawson already at the stove, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in the pan. "Sleep all right?" he asked, without turning around. "Well enough." The lie came easily. She'd barely slept at all, every creak of the house making her jolt awake, half convinced Thomas or Jack Yates was breaking down the door. Dawson glanced at her, and something in his expression said he knew she was lying but wasn't going to call her on it. "We'll do that shooting lesson after breakfast. Weather's good for it." They ate quickly, then Dawson led her out past the barn to a clearing where he'd set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. He handed her the shotgun, showing her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. "It's going to kick," he warned. "Don't fight it. Just let your body absorb the recoil. And don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger." Evelyn hefted the shotgun, surprised by its weight. The metal was cold against her hands, the stock smooth from years of use. "What am I aiming for?" "See that can on the left? Start there." Dawson stepped behind her, adjusting her stance with impersonal touches, a hand on her elbow, fingers correcting her grip. "Breathe in, let half of it out, then squeeze the trigger slow and steady." She did as he said, her heart hammering. The shotgun roared, the recoil slamming into her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble back. The can didn't even wobble. "Good," Dawson said. "You didn't flinch. Try again." For the next hour she practiced, the morning air filling with gunpowder smoke and the sharp crack of shots. Her shoulder began to ache, then throb, then go numb. She missed more than she hit, but gradually she started connecting, cans jumping and spinning off the log, small victories that made her chest warm with something like pride. "That's enough for today," Dawson finally said. "You're getting tired, and tired makes sloppy. We'll practice again tomorrow." Evelyn lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling with fatigue. "How long before I'm actually good at this?" "Depends on how often you practice. A few weeks, maybe a month." He took the shotgun from her and began cleaning it with practiced efficiency. "But you don't need to be a sharpshooter. You just need to be able to defend yourself if it comes to it." "You really think Thomas will come back?" "I think men like Thomas don't take kindly to being told no. Whether he comes himself or sends someone else, we need to be ready." Dawson's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "But that's why you're learning, so you're not helpless." The word helpless stuck in Evelyn's mind as they walked back to the house. She'd been helpless in Thomas's cabin, helpless on the streets of Bitter Creek, helpless her whole life in the face of circumstances she couldn't control. But standing there with the shotgun in her hands, feeling the weight of it, and knowing she could use it if she had to, she'd felt something different. Not powerful exactly, but not powerless either. That afternoon, while Dawson rode out to check the cattle in the north pasture, Evelyn worked in the garden and thought about what defense really meant. It meant more than just shooting straight. It meant having money saved, having skills that were valuable, having people who'd stand with you when trouble came. She had the skills now, or was learning them. She had Dawson, at least for the moment, and Margaret Brennan and the Morrisons. But money was still a problem. She'd been here 3 weeks and earned $45. Not nothing, but not enough to get far if she had to run again. The thought of running made her stomach turn. She was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of letting men like Thomas dictate the shape of her life. But she didn't know how to stop, didn't know how to stand and fight when the law itself said she belonged to someone else. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see not one rider, but 3, approaching from the direction of town. Her first instinct was to run for the house, grab the shotgun, bar the door. But something made her hold her ground, the garden hoe gripped tight in her hands. The lead rider was Sheriff Halstead, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a silver star pinned to his vest. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both young and serious-faced. They reined in at the edge of the yard, and Halstead tipped his hat to Evelyn. "Afternoon, ma'am. You must be Mrs. Harper. I'm Sheriff Halstead. Mind if we have a word?" "What about?" Evelyn's voice was steadier than she felt. "About Tom Garrett, and some allegations he's made." Halstead dismounted with a grunt, his deputies following suit. "Is Caleb Dawson around?" "He's out checking cattle. Should be back soon." "We'll wait then." Halstead's gaze took in the garden, the neat yard, the smoke rising from the chimney. "Place looks good. Heard Caleb hired on a housekeeper. Seems to be working out." Evelyn said nothing, just waited for the other shoe to drop. Halstead sighed. "Look, Mrs. Harper, I'm going to be straight with you. Tom Garrett came into my office yesterday claiming Caleb Dawson kidnapped you, held you here against your will, said you're his lawful wife and he wants you returned to him." The words hit Evelyn like a fist to the gut. "That's a lie." "I figured it might be, given the state you were in when you arrived in town. But I've got to investigate the claim. That's my job." Halstead's expression was sympathetic but firm. "So I'm asking, are you here of your own free will? Is Dawson treating you proper?" "Yes, to both." Evelyn lifted her chin, meeting the sheriff's eyes directly. "Mr. Dawson offered me work when I had nowhere else to go. He's been nothing but respectful. I'm staying because I choose to, not because anyone's forcing me." "And what about your husband? Tom says you ran off without cause, that you've been filling folks' heads with lies about him." "The only lies are the ones he's telling." Evelyn's hands tightened on the hoe. "He beat me, Sheriff. You can ask anyone who saw me that first day. I had bruises around my throat where he choked me, a split lip, cracked ribs. That's not a misunderstanding or a lover's spat. That's assault." One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably. Halstead's jaw tightened. "I saw the bruises myself when you arrived, heard the talk. But legally, a man's got certain rights regarding his wife, and unless you can prove he's a danger, how much more proof do you need than the marks he left on her body?" Dawson's voice cut across the yard, hard and cold. He rode in on his horse, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as he took in the scene. He dismounted in one smooth motion and walked to stand beside Evelyn, not touching her but close enough that his presence felt like a wall between her and the sheriff. "Caleb," Halstead nodded. "We were just discussing I heard what you were discussing. You're here because Tom Garrett filed a complaint. Let me guess. He claims I stole his wife, and he wants her back." "That's the gist of it. And what does the law say about a man who beats a woman half to death?" Dawson's voice was level, but there was fury underneath it, banked and controlled. "Because that's what Tom did. I saw the bruises myself when she got off that stagecoach. Everyone in town saw them. You gonna tell me that's legal? That a man can do that and then demand his victim come back for more? I'm not saying it's right, but you're not saying it's wrong either. You're standing here telling Mrs. Harper that because a piece of paper says she's Tom Garrett's wife, she's got no choice but to go back to him." Dawson took a step forward, and the deputies' hands drifted toward their guns. "That's not law, Sheriff. That's cowardice dressed up as duty." Halstead's face reddened. "Watch yourself, Dawson. I'm trying to handle this fair. Fair would be arresting Tom Garrett for assault. Fair would be protecting Mrs. Harper instead of threatening to send her back to the man who hurt her." Dawson's voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You want to take her? You'll have to go through me first." The silence that followed was taut as a stretched wire. Evelyn held her breath, watching the sheriff's face, trying to read which way he'd jump. The deputies looked uncertain, their hands still hovering near their weapons. Finally, Halstead let out a long breath. "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere today. I came to investigate a complaint, and I have. Mrs. Harper says she's here of her own will, and I've got no evidence otherwise." He looked at Evelyn, his expression softening slightly. "But you should know, ma'am, that Tom's not going to let this go. He's got pride, and he's got friends, and he's going to keep making trouble." "Let him try," Dawson said flatly. "I'm serious, Caleb. Tom's been talking to some of the boys at the saloon, getting them riled up, saying you stole what's his, that you need to be taught a lesson." Halstead shook his head. "I can keep the peace in town, but out here you're on your own. You'd best watch your back." "I always do." Halstead remounted, his deputies following suit. "One more thing. There was a situation 4 years back. A man died on your property under questionable circumstances. You were cleared, but there's still talk. Tom's trying to dredge that up, use it to paint you as dangerous. You might want to get ahead of that." Something flickered in Dawson's expression, too fast for Evelyn to read. "Ancient history. Not to the people who remember it." Halstead gathered his reins. "Just be careful, both of you. Things could get ugly real fast." They rode off, and Evelyn watched until they disappeared over the rise. Then her knees went weak, and she sat down hard on the ground, the hoe falling from her numb fingers. Dawson crouched beside her. "You all right?" "What did he mean about a man dying here?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "What happened 4 years ago?" Dawson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "You want the short version or the truth?" "The truth." He stood and walked to the porch, settling onto the steps. After a moment, Evelyn followed and sat beside him, leaving space between them. 4 years ago, Sarah was pregnant, Dawson said, his voice flat and factual. "About 7 months along. I was working on the south fence line when a man showed up at the house. Drifter named Colt Brennan. No relation to the doc. He was drunk, looking for food and money. Sarah tried to give him what we could spare, but it wasn't enough for him. He wanted more." Evelyn's chest tightened. She could see where this was going. "I came back for the midday meal and found him trying to force his way into the house. Sarah was on the porch, bleeding from a cut on her head where he'd hit her. She was crying, begging him not to hurt the baby." Dawson's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't think. I just acted. Got him away from her, and we fought. He had a knife, I had a shovel from the fence work. When it was over, he was dead, and I was standing over him covered in his blood." "Self-defense," Evelyn whispered. "That's what the sheriff ruled. But Brennan had family in the territory, and they weren't satisfied with that answer. They wanted me hanged, or at least run out. Sheriff Halstead stood firm, said the evidence was clear, but the talk never really stopped. Some folks still think I murdered him in cold blood." "Did Sarah..." She went into labor that night. Shock maybe, or the injury to her head. The baby came too early, and neither of them survived it. Dawson's voice cracked slightly on the last words. So I didn't just lose them. I lost them because I killed a man, even if it was to protect them. And there's days I wonder if I'd handled it different, talked instead of fought. Maybe they'd still be here. Evelyn felt tears burning in her eyes. You can't know that. You did what anyone would do. You protected your wife. Doesn't change the outcome. Dawson looked at her, and his eyes were full of old pain. I'm telling you this because you need to know what you're getting into by staying here. Tom's going to use this against me, against you. He's going to say I'm violent, unstable, dangerous. And some people are going to believe him because they want to believe the worst. I don't care what people believe. The words surprised Evelyn with their vehemence. I know what I've seen. You've been nothing but kind and decent to me. You've given me safety when I had none, dignity when I'd been stripped of it. Whatever happened 4 years ago doesn't change that. Dawson studied her face, searching for something. You sure about that? Because once you're tied to me in people's minds, it's going to make your life harder. Might be better for you to move on, find work somewhere else where there's no history following you. I'm already tied to a man who beat me, Evelyn said quietly. At least with you, it's by choice, and it's for something good instead of something that destroys me. They sat in silence as the sun tracked across the sky and shadows lengthened across the yard. Finally, Dawson stood and offered Evelyn his hand, pulling her to her feet. Then we'd better prepare for what's coming, he said, because Tom's not going to stop, and neither are the people who want to see me fail. Over the next 2 weeks, the tension ratcheted higher. Riders passed the ranch at odd hours, sometimes stopping to watch the house from a distance before moving on. Supplies Dawson ordered in town were suddenly unavailable or delayed. Margaret Brennan stopped by twice, bringing food and warnings that Tom was drinking heavy and talking violent. He's gathering support, Margaret said, her face grim. Talking about his rights as a husband, about Caleb being a killer who's corrupted you. Vernon Pike's backing him, probably sees an opportunity to cause trouble. You need to be ready. Evelyn and Dawson fell into a routine of watchfulness. She practiced shooting daily until she could hit the cans more often than not. Dawson kept the rifle close, always aware of their surroundings. They locked the doors at night and slept light, alert to any sound that didn't belong. Despite the constant vigilance, life continued. Evelyn finished cleaning out the root cellar and organized it for winter storage. She made preserves from the early berries, mended all of Dawson's clothes, even started sewing herself a new dress from fabric he'd brought from town. The work was grounding, a reminder that life was more than fear and waiting for violence. She also learned more about Dawson in the quiet moments between chores. He'd grown up in Missouri, come west after the war looking for land and peace. He'd met Sarah at a church social in Colorado and courted her for 6 months before proposing. They'd been happy, he said, in the simple way of people who wanted the same things: a home, a family, a life built on honest work. She made this place feel alive, he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Used to sing while she cooked, terrible voice, but she didn't care. She'd garden in her bare feet and track dirt through the house, and I'd pretend to be annoyed, but I loved it. Loved that she was so completely herself, no pretense or performance. You must miss her terribly, Evelyn said. Every day. But it's different now than it was at first. Then it was this raw, bleeding wound that wouldn't heal. Now it's more like an ache that's part of me, something I've learned to carry. He glanced at Evelyn. You'll feel that way too someday, about all of this. The fear will fade into something you can live with. Evelyn hoped he was right. But as the days passed and the sense of impending confrontation grew stronger, she wondered if she'd live long enough to find out. The confrontation came on a Saturday, 3 weeks after Sheriff Halstead's visit. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she heard the thunder of multiple horses and turned to see 6 riders approaching fast. Tom Garrett led the group, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. Behind him rode Jack Yates, Vernon Pike, and 3 other men Evelyn recognized from the saloon. She dropped the laundry basket and ran for the house, shouting for Dawson. He emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, and positioned himself between the approaching riders and the porch where Evelyn stood. That's far enough, Dawson called as the riders pulled up 20 feet away. You're on my property uninvited. State your business or leave. Tom dismounted, swaying slightly. I'm here for my wife. You've had your fun playing house, Dawson, but it's time she came home where she belongs. Mrs. Harper doesn't want to go with you, Dawson said, his voice level. She's made that clear to you, to me, and to the sheriff. You need to accept it and move on. The hell I do. Tom took a step forward and Dawson raised the rifle slightly. Tom stopped, his hands spread in mock surrender. Easy now. I'm not here to fight. Just here to collect what's mine. I'm not yours, Evelyn called from the porch, her voice shaking but clear. I never was. You wanted a servant you could abuse, and when I didn't break fast enough, you threw me away. You don't get to change your mind now. Tom's face darkened. You ungrateful bitch. I gave you a home, a name, and this is how you repay me? By whoring yourself to a killer? Watch your mouth, Dawson said, and there was ice in his voice now. You've got 3 seconds to get back on your horse and leave. After that, you're trespassing, and I'm within my rights to defend my property. Your property? Tom laughed, ugly and harsh. She's my property, legal and binding. You can't keep her from me. He doesn't have to keep me from you, Evelyn said, and she stepped off the porch with the shotgun Dawson had taught her to use, holding it steady despite her trembling hands. I'm keeping myself from you, and if you try to take me, I'll put a hole in you big enough to see daylight through. The men behind Tom shifted nervously. Vernon Pike's smile had faded. Jack Yates looked uncertain. Tom stared at Evelyn, at the shotgun pointed at his chest, and something like realization crossed his face. She wasn't the same broken woman he'd thrown from his cabin. She'd found her spine somewhere in the last month, and she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Or if she was afraid, she was more angry than scared, and that made her dangerous. You'll regret this, Tom said finally, his voice low and venomous. Both of you. I'll make sure of it. You can try, Dawson said. But you come on my land again, you come near Mrs. Harper again, and I won't hesitate. Clear? For a long moment, Tom just stood there, rage and humiliation warring on his face. Then he spat in the dirt, remounted his horse, and wheeled it around. This isn't over, he called back as the group rode off. Not by a damn sight. They watched until the riders disappeared. Then Evelyn lowered the shotgun, her arms shaking with reaction. Dawson took it from her gently and set it aside, then put a hand on her shoulder. You did good, he said quietly. Standing up like that. That took courage. I was terrified, Evelyn admitted. Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway. He squeezed her shoulder once, then let go. But he meant what he said. This isn't over. He's going to come back, and next time he might not come with just words. Then we'll be ready. Evelyn looked up at him, and she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. Together. Together, Dawson agreed. And in that moment, standing in the yard with the smell of gunpowder still in the air and the distant sound of hoofbeats fading, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. And for the first time in her life, she had someone fighting alongside her who didn't expect her to lose. That night, neither of them slept much. Dawson sat in a chair by the front window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for movement. Evelyn lay upstairs listening to every creak and groan of the old house, her hand resting on the shotgun Dawson had insisted she keep beside her bed. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, she came downstairs to find him still in the chair, his eyes red-rimmed but alert. You should rest, she said quietly. I can keep watch. I'm fine. But he stood stiffly, his back protesting the night spent in the chair. Coffee would be good, though. They moved through the morning in tense silence, each of them listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. Dawson did the essential chores, fed the animals, checked the fences nearest the house, but stayed close, always within earshot. Evelyn cooked and cleaned with half her attention on the windows, tracking every shadow that moved across the yard. By midday, the waiting had scraped her nerves raw. She was scrubbing the kitchen table for the third time when Dawson came in and gently took the rag from her hands. You're going to wear a hole in the wood, he said. I need to do something. I can't just sit here waiting for him to come back. Then don't wait. Come with me. Dawson headed for the door, and after a moment Evelyn followed. He led her to the barn and into the tack room, where he moved aside a stack of old blankets to reveal a strongbox bolted to the floor. He worked the combination and opened it, revealing a small collection of papers, some cash, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Sarah," he said, lifting out the journal. "She kept records, everything that happened on the ranch, every transaction, every visitor, dates, names, what was said. She was meticulous about it." He handed the journal to Evelyn. "I want you to do the same. Write down everything that's happened since you got here. Tom's visits, what he said, what Yates said, when the sheriff came. All of it." "Why?" "Because if this goes to court, we need evidence. Your word against Tom's won't be enough, not when the law already favors him. But a detailed record, corroborated by witnesses, written in real time, that's harder to dismiss." Dawson pulled out the cash and counted it. "There's also this, $400. It's everything I've got saved. If things go bad, if you need to run, you take this and you go. Don't wait for me, don't look back. Just get somewhere safe." Evelyn stared at the money, her throat tight. "I can't take your savings. It's not for me. It's for you." His voice was firm. "I can rebuild if I have to. But you need options. Need the means to get away if Tom or his friends corner you when I'm not here. Promise me you'll take it if you need to. Caleb, promise me." She looked into his eyes and saw the fear there, carefully controlled but real. He was preparing for the worst, making sure she'd survive even if he didn't. The realization made her chest ache. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded once and closed the strongbox. "Good. Now let's hope we never need to use any of this." Over the next few days, Evelyn filled pages of the journal with careful, precise notes. She documented Tom's first visit through Jack Yates, the sheriff's investigation, Tom's confrontation with his armed friends. She wrote down the dates and times, who was present, what threats were made. The act of recording it made it real in a way that felt both terrifying and empowering. This was evidence, proof, a record that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. On the fourth day after Tom's visit, Margaret Brennan arrived with her husband in tow. Doc Brennan was a quiet man with kind eyes and gentle hands, and he examined Evelyn's fading bruises with professional detachment. "The ribs healed well," he said. "No permanent damage that I can see. You're lucky." "Lucky," Evelyn repeated flatly. "Poor choice of words," Doc Brennan amended. "You're resilient. That's different." He looked at Dawson. "I heard about Tom's visit. Margaret told me. I want you to know that if this goes to an inquest or a hearing, I'll testify about the injuries I saw when Mrs. Harper first arrived. That kind of violence leaves a mark, and not just on the body." "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice thick. Margaret squeezed her hand. "You're not alone in this. People are watching, and not everyone's on Tom's side. The respectable folks in town, the ones who matter, they see what he is, they see what you're trying to do here." "What am I trying to do?" Evelyn asked. "Survive?" "Build a life," Margaret said firmly. "On your own terms. That scares men like Tom because it means they don't have power over you anymore. But it also inspires people like us who believe women deserve better than being property." After the Brennans left, Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the sun sink toward the mountains. The words, "build a life," echoed in her mind. Was that what she was doing? She'd been so focused on survival, on getting through each day without falling apart, that she hadn't let herself think beyond that. But she had built something here, hadn't she? The house was clean and warm. The garden was thriving. The meals she cooked were good and satisfying. She'd learned to shoot, learned to stand her ground, learned that she was stronger than she'd believed. And she'd found in Caleb Dawson something she'd never expected. A partner who saw her as an equal, who valued her work and her judgment, who stood beside her instead of over her. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered Thomas Garrett's advertisement. It was better. Harder, yes, and uncertain, but better because it was hers. She was still standing there when Dawson came to join her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He gave her one and leaned against the porch railing, his eyes on the darkening horizon. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "I was thinking about what Margaret said, about building a life." Evelyn sipped the coffee, savoring its bitter warmth. "I never thought of it that way before. Always felt like I was just reacting, just trying to keep my head above water. But maybe she's right. Maybe this is more than surviving. It is, Dawson said quietly. You've made this place feel like a home again. Not the same as it was with Sarah, but good in its own way. I didn't realize how much I'd let it all slip until you showed me what it could be. The compliment made Evelyn's cheeks warm. I'm just doing my job. It's more than a job and you know it. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. I want you to know that whatever happens with Tom, whatever the law decides, you've got a place here as long as you want it, not as an employee, as a partner. Equal stake in the ranch, equal say in decisions. I'd put it in writing if you want. Evelyn's breath caught. Caleb, I can't. That's too much. It's not. You've earned it. His voice was firm. And more than that, I trust you. Trust your judgment, your work, your word. That's worth more than money to me. So if you want it, it's yours. She stood there, the coffee cup trembling in her hands, and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Nobody had ever offered her something like this. Partnership, trust, a stake in something real. Her whole life she'd been dependent, dispensable, always aware that she could be cast aside the moment she became inconvenient. But Dawson was offering her permanence, security, a future. I want it, she whispered. I want to stay. Then it's settled. But he reached out and took her free hand, squeezing it gently. We'll get through this together. Tom, the law, whatever comes. Together. The touch sent warmth spreading through Evelyn's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not romantic, or at least not entirely, but something deeper. Recognition. The sense of being seen completely and accepted anyway. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. She squeezed back, then let go before the moment could become awkward. They stood in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and for the first time since leaving St. Louis, Evelyn felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The fragile peace lasted 3 more days. Then Sheriff Halstead returned, this time with a different kind of news. There's been a development, he said, standing in the yard while Dawson and Evelyn watched from the porch. Tom Garrett filed a formal petition with the territorial court. He's demanding either you return to him as his legal wife or he wants financial compensation for breach of marital contract. He's also pushing for an investigation into Caleb, claiming you're being held here through intimidation and that Caleb's past violence makes him unfit to shelter a vulnerable woman. That's insane, Evelyn said. I've told you I'm here willingly. I know, but the court has to hear the case. Halstead looked genuinely regretful. There'll be a hearing in 2 weeks at the county seat. You'll both need to testify. Tom will have his say, you'll have yours, and a judge will decide. What are the possible outcomes? Dawson asked, his voice carefully neutral. Best case, the judge rules in your favor and Tom has to leave you alone. Worst case, he orders Mrs. Harper to return to her husband or pay damages she doesn't have. Halstead paused. There's also the question of the old investigation into Colt Brennan's death. Tom's lawyer is trying to use that to paint you as dangerous. I don't think it'll stick. The case was closed years ago, but it could influence the judge's opinion. After Halstead left, Evelyn and Dawson sat at the kitchen table and planned. They would need witnesses, Margaret and Doc Brennan, Ben Morrison if he'd testify, anyone who'd seen Evelyn's injuries or could speak to Dawson's character. They'd need the journal with its meticulous records. They'd need to present a unified front that showed Evelyn was competent, willing, and in no way coerced. We should also consider getting you a lawyer, Dawson said. Someone who can argue the legal points, make the case that Tom forfeited his rights when he beat you. That'll cost money we don't have. I'll sell some cattle if I have to. This is too important to go in unprepared. They worked late into the night, writing down everything they could remember, organizing their evidence, preparing for the battle ahead. And when Evelyn finally climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted and anxious, she found herself thinking not about the hearing but about Dawson's offer of partnership. Equal stake, equal say, a future built together. She wanted that future, wanted it with an intensity that scared her because wanting things had only ever led to pain. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time she'd chosen right. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and worry. Dawson hired a lawyer from the county seat, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Walsh, who listened to their story with clinical attention and asked pointed questions about dates, times, witnesses. "Your case is strong," Walsh said after reviewing the journal and examining the last faint traces of Evelyn's bruises. "But family law is complicated, and judges have broad discretion. Some take a strict view of marriage vows, others are more sympathetic to women in your situation. We won't know which kind we're dealing with until we're in the courtroom." Margaret and Doc Brennan agreed to testify, as did Ben Morrison and his mother, who'd become friends with Evelyn during several visits to the Broken Bell. Even Sheriff Halstead, though he couldn't take sides officially, agreed to provide a factual account of the investigation and what he'd observed. The night before they were due to leave for the county seat, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She paced her room, rehearsing what she'd say, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. Finally, she gave up and went downstairs, thinking to make tea. She found Dawson at the kitchen table, a lantern burning low, Sarah's wedding ring quilt spread out before him. He was running his fingers over the stitching, lost in memory. "Couldn't sleep either?" Evelyn asked softly. He looked up, not startled. "Too much thinking. About tomorrow?" "About a lot of things." He gestured to the chair across from him, and Evelyn sat. "I've been thinking about what happens after. If we win, if Tom has to leave you alone, what that means for us." "What do you think it means?" "I think it means we have to decide what this is." His eyes met hers, steady and serious. "This arrangement between us. Started as employer and employee, but it's become more than that. We're partners now, at least in the work. But I need to know what you want beyond that, whether you're planning to stay long-term, build something permanent here, or if this is just a stopping point until you can move on to something better." Evelyn's heart pounded. "What do you want?" "I want you to stay. Not out of obligation or fear or because you've got nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here. Because this feels like home to you the way it's starting to feel like home to me again." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I care about you, Evelyn. Not the way I cared about Sarah. That was different. We were different people then. But I care about who you are, what you've survived, how you've fought to reclaim yourself. And I think we could build something good together if you're willing." The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Evelyn felt tears pressing behind her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being offered something precious. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to build that life Margaret talked about, with you, as partners." She hesitated, then added, "And maybe, eventually, as something more. If that's what you want too." "I do." Dawson reached across the table and took her hand. "But no rush. We've both been hurt, both lost people we loved. We can take our time figuring out what this becomes." "One day at a time," Evelyn said, echoing his earlier words. "One day at a time," he agreed. They sat there in the lamplight, hands clasped, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not the absence of fear exactly, but the presence of hope. Tomorrow they'd face Tom and the judge, and whatever verdict came down. But tonight, in this moment, she had this. Someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. Someone who offered partnership instead of ownership. Someone who understood that healing took time and was willing to wait. It was more than she'd ever dared to dream of, and she was going to fight like hell to keep it. Morning came too soon. They loaded the wagon before dawn and began the long drive to the county seat, Catherine Walsh riding alongside on her own horse. The journey took most of the day, the landscape shifting from the familiar hills around the ranch to flatter, more settled country dotted with farms and small towns. They arrived in the late afternoon and took rooms at a modest hotel. Walsh went to file final paperwork while Dawson and Evelyn ate a quiet dinner in the hotel dining room, neither of them with much appetite. "You nervous?" Dawson asked. "Terrified," Evelyn admitted. "What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if he decides Tom's rights matter more than what he did to me?" "Then we appeal. Or we find another way." Dawson's voice was calm, steady. "But don't borrow trouble. We've got a strong case, good witnesses, the truth on our side. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. "The law didn't protect me when Tom beat me. Why should I trust it to protect me now?" "Because this time you're not alone. This time you've got people standing with you." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, stilling their anxious movement. Whatever happens, you're not going back to him. I'll make sure of that, even if we have to leave the territory entirely. The promise steadied something in Evelyn's chest. She nodded, swallowing hard, and they finished the meal in silence. That night she lay in her hotel bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town outside her window. Somewhere in this same town, Tom was sleeping, probably drunk, probably confident he'd win because the law was designed for men like him. But Evelyn wasn't the same woman who'd stumbled off that stagecoach 6 weeks ago. She'd been broken then, beaten down, ready to accept whatever scraps of survival she could find. Now she was stronger, clearer, certain of her own worth. She'd found her voice and her spine, and tomorrow she was going to use both. She thought of Dawson in the next room, probably awake like her, probably worrying. She thought of the partnership he'd offered, the future they could build if the judge was fair. She thought of the Broken Bell Ranch and how it had become home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with belonging. And she made herself a promise. No matter what happened tomorrow, she would tell the truth. She would stand tall. She would show them all that she was nobody's property, that she'd survived the worst they could throw at her, and that she was claiming her right to a life of her own choosing. The sun would rise soon. The hearing would begin. And Evelyn Harper would face it the way she'd learned to face everything since leaving Thomas Garrett's cabin, with her eyes open, her hands steady, and her heart set on freedom. She woke to pale light filtering through thin curtains and the sound of wagons rattling past on the street below. For a moment, Evelyn lay still, gathering her courage like armor, piece by piece. Then she rose and dressed in the best of the clothes Margaret had given her, a deep green dress with a high collar and long sleeves that covered the last faint shadows of bruises. She braided her hair severely and pinned it in a coronet, the style making her look older, more serious. When she came downstairs, Dawson was waiting in the lobby, dressed in his only suit, looking uncomfortable but determined. Catherine Walsh stood beside him, reviewing papers, her expression focused and sharp. "Ready?" Walsh asked, looking up. "As I'll ever be," Evelyn said. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building at the center of town, imposing and official. They climbed the steps together, Evelyn's hand gripping the railing for support. Inside, the halls smelled of old wood and legal documents, and their footsteps echoed on the polished floors. The courtroom was smaller than Evelyn had imagined, with wooden benches for spectators and a raised platform where the judge would sit. Tom was already there with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. Tom's eyes found Evelyn immediately, and she saw satisfaction flicker across his face. He thought he'd already won. She lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching. "Whatever you think you know about me is wrong," she thought fiercely. "I'm not yours anymore. I never really was." They took their seats at the table opposite Tom's, and Walsh laid out her papers with methodical precision. Margaret and Doc Brennan sat in the spectator section, along with Ben Morrison and his mother. Their presence was a comfort, a reminder that she wasn't fighting alone. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Raymond Harrison entered, a stern-faced man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He settled behind the bench and surveyed the room before speaking. "This is a petition brought by Thomas Garrett seeking the return of his lawful wife, Evelyn Harper, or financial compensation for abandonment of marital duties. We'll hear arguments from both sides, testimony from relevant witnesses, and I'll make a determination based on territorial law and the specific facts of this case." His voice was dry, businesslike. "Mr. Sutton, you may proceed." Tom's lawyer stood and launched into his argument with practiced ease. He painted Tom as a hardworking man who'd offered Evelyn a home and a future, only to be rejected without cause. He claimed Evelyn had been seduced away by Caleb Dawson, a man with a violent past who'd killed a man on his own property. He argued that marriage was a sacred contract that couldn't be dissolved simply because a wife changed her mind. "Mrs. Garrett willingly entered into marriage with my client," Sutton said, his voice smooth and confident. "She took vows before witnesses. Those vows are binding. Whatever minor disagreements occurred between husband and wife should be resolved within the marriage, not by running away to another man's bed." Evelyn's hands clenched under the table. Walsh had warned her this would happen, that Tom's lawyer would try to make her look unfaithful, morally compromised, a woman who couldn't be trusted. When Sutton finished, Walsh stood and began her counterargument. Her voice was crisp, factual, devastating in its precision. Your Honor, this is not a case of a woman abandoning her marital duties. This is a case of a woman fleeing for her life from a man who beat her so severely that she arrived in Bitter Creek with a split lip, swollen face, bruised throat, showing clear fingerprints from strangulation, and what we believe were cracked ribs. Dr. Brennan examined her injuries and will testify to their extent and severity. Multiple witnesses saw her condition when she arrived. This was not a minor disagreement. This was assault. She presented the journal Evelyn had kept, walking the judge through the timeline, the beatings, the abandonment, Tom's subsequent attempts to force her return through intimidation. She presented Sheriff Halstead's report documenting the investigation. She called witness after witness, each one building a picture of what had really happened. Margaret testified about the supplies she'd brought Evelyn, the bruises she'd seen, the fear in Evelyn's eyes. Doc Brennan provided clinical testimony about the injuries, stating unequivocally that they were consistent with repeated violent assault. Ben Morrison described finding Evelyn at the ranch and offering his family's help because she'd clearly been in distress. Then Walsh called Evelyn to the stand. Evelyn walked to the witness box on trembling legs and placed her hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. She sat and looked out at the courtroom, at Tom's sneering face, at the judge's neutral expression, at Dawson's steady, encouraging gaze. Walsh began with simple questions, establishing the timeline of Evelyn's marriage and what had happened in those 3 days with Tom. Then she asked Evelyn to describe the beatings. Evelyn's voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She described the first night when Tom had come to bed drunk and angry, blaming her for not being the miracle that would fix his failed life. She described the backhand across her face when she'd asked him to be gentle, the choking when she'd tried to defend herself, the kicks to her ribs when she'd fallen, the final degradation when he'd thrown money at her and ordered her out like she was a whore he'd tired of. He told me I was worthless, Evelyn said, her eyes locked on the judge, that I was damaged goods, that no one would want me. He said I should be grateful he'd married me at all, even if I wasn't fit to be anyone's wife. And then he put his hands around my throat and squeezed until I couldn't breathe, and I thought I was going to die in that cabin and no one would care. The courtroom was silent. Even Tom had stopped sneering. What did you do after he threw you out? Walsh asked gently. I got on the stagecoach with the $3 he'd given me. I had nowhere to go. No family, no friends. I just knew I couldn't stay. Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. When I arrived in Bitter Creek, Mr. Pike from the saloon approached me. He offered me work, the kind of work where I'd have to sell my body to survive. I was about to accept because I didn't see any other choice. That's when Mr. Dawson offered me legitimate work. Housekeeping, fair wages. No strings attached. And has Mr. Dawson ever been inappropriate with you? Ever threatened you or coerced you? Never. He's been nothing but respectful and kind. He gave me safety when I had none. He taught me to defend myself. He offered me partnership in his ranch. Equal stake, equal say. He's treated me with more dignity and respect than anyone else in my life. Evelyn's voice broke slightly. Including my own husband. Walsh let that sit for a moment, then said, Do you want to return to Thomas Garrett? No, never. Why not? Because he'll kill me. The words came out flat, certain. Maybe not the first time or the second, but eventually, if I go back, he'll beat me one time too many and I'll die. And I don't want to die. I want to live. I want to build a life where I'm valued for more than my ability to endure pain. I want to be free. Walsh nodded and returned to her seat. Tom's lawyer stood for cross-examination, trying to poke holes in Evelyn's story, suggesting she'd exaggerated the beatings or provoked Tom somehow. But Evelyn held firm, repeating the same truths over and over, until even Sutton seemed to realize he was only making his client look worse. When Evelyn finally stepped down, her legs were shaking, but her head was high. She'd told the truth. Whatever happened now was out of her hands. The judge called a brief recess, and they stepped outside into the cool morning air. Margaret hugged Evelyn tightly while Doc Brennan spoke quietly with Walsh about the strength of their case. You did beautifully, Margaret whispered. So brave. Sarah would be proud. The unexpected mention of Sarah made Evelyn's eyes burn. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and looked for Dawson. He stood apart from the group, staring at the courthouse with an expression she couldn't read. She went to him. "Are you all right?" "I'm angry," he said quietly, listening to what he did to you, hearing it laid out in detail. "I knew it was bad, but hearing you say it out loud." His hands clenched. "I want to hurt him for what he did to you." "The best revenge is winning this case," Evelyn said. "Showing him he doesn't own me, that he can't control me anymore." "I know. Doesn't stop me from wanting it, though." When court reconvened, Walsh called Dawson to the stand. Tom's lawyer immediately objected, trying to keep his testimony out, but the judge allowed it. Dawson testified about finding Evelyn that first day, about the extent of her injuries, about offering her work and nothing more. He spoke calmly, factually, his voice never rising but carrying absolute conviction. Then Sutton stood for cross-examination, and his whole demeanor changed. He went for blood. "Mr. Dawson, isn't it true that 4 years ago you killed a man on your property?" "Yes." Dawson's voice didn't waver. "In defense of my wife. A wife who subsequently died, along with your unborn child." "That's correct." "Tragic circumstances. Some might say suspicious circumstances." Sutton paced in front of the witness stand. "A man shows up at your property, you kill him, and hours later your wife dies. Convenient that there were no witnesses to what really happened." Walsh shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Dawson was investigated and cleared of any wrongdoing. This is character assassination, not relevant testimony." "I'll allow it," Judge Harrison said. "But get to your point, Mr. Sutton." "My point is that Mr. Dawson has a history of violence. He's a man who resorts to killing when challenged. Is it not reasonable to suggest that Mrs. Harper might be afraid of him? That she might be staying at his ranch not out of choice, but out of fear of what he'll do if she tries to leave?" "That's a lie," Dawson said, his voice hard now. "I've never threatened Mrs. Harper, never raised a hand to her or even raised my voice. She's free to leave any time she wants, and I've told her that repeatedly." "So you say, but we only have your word for that, and the word of a woman who may be too terrified to tell the truth." Evelyn couldn't stay silent. She stood up, ignoring Walsh's sharp look. "That's not true. I'm not afraid of Mr. Dawson. The only man I'm afraid of is Thomas Garrett, and he's the one trying to force me back into captivity." Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Mrs. Harper, please sit down. You'll have your chance to speak." But the outburst had done its job. The judge was looking at Tom now with new scrutiny, and Tom was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. Sutton tried to recover, asking more questions about the ranch, about the sleeping arrangements, trying to imply impropriety. But Dawson answered each question with patient honesty, never defensive, never evasive. He described separate bedrooms, proper conduct, a working relationship that had evolved into friendship and partnership, but never crossed inappropriate lines. "Mrs. Harper is a good woman who deserves a good life," Dawson said finally. "That's all I've tried to give her. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But she's not property to be returned to a man who beat her. She's a person with rights and dignity, and she deserves the freedom to choose her own path." When Dawson stepped down, Evelyn saw respect in the judge's eyes. Tom's lawyer called Tom to the stand as his final witness, and it was a disaster. Tom tried to play the victim, claiming he'd been reasonable, that Evelyn had misunderstood his discipline, that any husband had the right to correct his wife's behavior. But under Walsh's cross-examination, he grew defensive, then angry, and finally revealed exactly what kind of man he was. "She was supposed to be grateful," Tom snarled when Walsh pressed him about the beatings. "I gave her my name, my home. She owed me obedience. When she didn't give it, I had every right to remind her of her place." "By choking her?" Walsh asked mildly. "By doing what was necessary to maintain order in my household." "And when you threw her out with $3 and told her she was worthless, was that also necessary?" Tom's face reddened. "She wasn't fulfilling her duties. I had no use for a wife who couldn't even manage basic tasks without complaint." "So you admit you beat her and then abandoned her?" "I admit I disciplined a disobedient wife, then released her from obligations she clearly couldn't handle." Tom's voice dripped with contempt. What happens to her after that isn't my concern. Yet you're here today demanding she return to you. Why is that, Mr. Garrett? Tom opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing he'd been trapped. If he said he wanted her back, it contradicted his claim she was worthless. If he admitted he just wanted to save face, he looked petty and vindictive. She's my wife, he finally said. That means something. Does it? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like what it means to you is ownership, not partnership, not love, not even basic respect, just ownership of something you feel entitled to control. Walsh turned to the judge. Your Honor, I think we've heard enough. Mr. Garrett has admitted to beating Mrs. Harper, to abandoning her, and to viewing her as property rather than as a person. The law may give husbands certain rights, but it doesn't give them the right to brutalize their wives and then demand those wives return for more abuse. We're asking the court to dissolve this marriage on grounds of cruelty and abandonment, and to issue a protective order preventing Mr. Garrett from contacting Mrs. Harper in the future. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression thoughtful. I'll take this matter under advisement and issue a ruling by end of business today. Court is adjourned. The waiting was excruciating. They returned to the hotel, none of them able to eat, all of them running through the testimony in their minds and trying to predict which way the judge would rule. Walsh was cautiously optimistic, but warned that judges could be unpredictable, especially in matters of family law where tradition often trumped justice. At 4 o'clock, a messenger arrived with a summons to return to the courthouse. They made the walk in tense silence, Evelyn's heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The courtroom was nearly empty now, just the principals and a few curious onlookers. Judge Harrison entered and took his seat, a document in his hand. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented in this case, he began, his voice formal and measured. This is a difficult situation involving competing legal principles, the sanctity of marriage versus the right of individuals to be free from violence and coercion. Having considered all factors, I've reached the following conclusions. Evelyn gripped Dawson's hand under the table, her breath caught in her throat. First, regarding the allegation that Mrs. Harper is being held against her will by Mr. Dawson, I find no credible evidence to support this claim. Mrs. Harper testified clearly and convincingly that she remains at the Broken Bell Ranch of her own free choice. Mr. Dawson's past, while tragic, has no bearing on his current conduct, which appears by all accounts to be above reproach. Tom's lawyer leaned forward, clearly about to object, but the judge raised a hand. Second, regarding Mr. Garrett's petition for the return of his wife, I find that Mr. Garrett, by his own admission, subjected Mrs. Harper to physical violence, including choking and beating. He then abandoned her with minimal resources and no support. These actions constitute cruelty and abandonment sufficient to void the marital contract. Furthermore, Mr. Garrett's testimony demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of marriage as partnership versus marriage as ownership. His stated belief that he had every right to beat his wife reveals a character unsuited to the responsibilities of matrimony. Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that any sound might change what was happening. Therefore, I hereby grant a dissolution of the marriage between Thomas Garrett and Evelyn Harper on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. Furthermore, I issue a restraining order prohibiting Mr. Garrett from contacting, approaching, or harassing Mrs. Harper in any way for a period of not less than 5 years. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. Mr. Garrett's petition for financial compensation is denied. Judge Harrison looked directly at Tom. Mr. Garrett, you brought this situation upon yourself through your own actions. You have no one to blame but yourself. Consider yourself fortunate that I'm not pursuing criminal charges for assault. Tom lurched to his feet. This is outrageous. She's my wife. She was your wife. Now she's a free woman, and you will leave her alone. The judge's voice was iron. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Garrett from the courthouse. As Tom was led out, still protesting, Evelyn collapsed against Dawson, sobbing with relief and shock and overwhelming gratitude. Walsh was smiling, Margaret was crying, and Dawson's arms were around Evelyn, solid and steady and real. It's over, he murmured into her hair. You're free. You're safe. We're safe, she corrected, her voice muffled against his chest. We're both safe now. They stayed in town long enough for Walsh to file the final paperwork and for Evelyn to legally reclaim her maiden name. Then they loaded the wagon and began the long journey home to the Broken Bell Ranch. The ride back felt different than the ride there, lighter, easier, like they'd shed a burden that had been crushing them both. They talked about plans for the ranch, about bringing in more cattle come spring, about maybe hiring some help so they wouldn't be so overwhelmed with work. They talked about the future with an ease that had been impossible when that future was so uncertain. When they crested the final rise and saw the ranch spread out below them, familiar and welcoming in the afternoon light, Evelyn felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not just a place to survive, but a place to live. A place to build the kind of life she'd always wanted but never dared to believe she deserved. Over the following weeks, word spread about the court decision. Some people congratulated them, others gossiped and speculated, but mostly life continued. They fell back into their routine, work and meals and quiet evenings on the porch watching the stars come out. But there was a new ease between them now, a deepening trust that came from having faced the worst together and survived. One evening, about a month after the hearing, Dawson asked Evelyn to take a walk with him. They followed the creek up into the hills, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones, until they reached a spot where the land opened up and you could see for miles in every direction. I used to come here with Sarah, Dawson said quietly, when we needed to think or when we just wanted to be away from everything. It was her favorite place on the ranch. Evelyn had wondered if Sarah would always be a ghost between them, a presence that made it impossible for them to move forward. But standing here now, she didn't feel jealousy or inadequacy. She felt grateful that Sarah had existed, that she'd loved this land and this man and left her mark on both. Thank you for bringing me here, she said. I wanted you to see it, wanted you to know that this is yours too now. All of it. The land, the house, the memories. You're part of this place, part of its history and its future. Dawson turned to face her, his expression serious. We've been through a lot together these past months, survived things that would have broken weaker people, and somewhere along the way, we became partners. Real partners. But I want you to know that if you ever want more than that, if you ever think you might want what Sarah and I had, marriage, family, a life built together in every sense, I'd be honored. No pressure, no expectations. Just want you to know the option's there if you ever want it. Evelyn's heart swelled so full she thought it might overflow. I'd like that, she said softly. Not right away. We both need time to heal, to be sure. But someday. Yes. Dawson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost young. Someday, then. He took her hand and they stood there as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, two people who'd been broken and had found a way to be whole together, watching the day end and knowing that tomorrow would come with all its possibilities. The seasons turned. Winter came hard and cold, testing them with blizzards and frozen pipes, and the constant work of keeping animals alive in brutal conditions. But they faced it together, and when spring arrived with its muddy thaw and the first green shoots pushing through the soil, they celebrated having survived. Margaret became a frequent visitor, bringing news from town and helping Evelyn plan an expanded garden. The Morrisons invited them to family gatherings where Evelyn learned what it felt like to be part of a community that accepted her without judgment. Doc Brennan checked on her periodically, monitoring not just her physical health, but her emotional recovery, and gradually pronounced her healed as much as anyone ever healed from trauma. Evelyn continued keeping the journal, but the entries changed from documentation of threats and violence to records of daily life, cattle sales and crop yields, visits from neighbors, small moments of joy and contentment. The pages filled with evidence of a life being built, a future taking shape. 1 year to the day after she'd stumbled off that stagecoach in Bitter Creek, Evelyn and Dawson stood before a judge again, but this time it was to be married. Margaret and Doc Brennan served as witnesses, and afterward they had a simple celebration at the ranch with neighbors who'd become friends. Evelyn wore a dress she'd sewn herself in the same deep green as the one she'd worn to the hearing, a deliberate choice to reclaim that day's pain and transform it into something beautiful. Dawson wore his suit again, but this time he smiled, and when he took her hand to speak his vows, his voice was strong and sure. "I promise to be your partner in all things," he said. "To stand beside you, not over you. To offer strength when you need it and accept yours when I do. To build a life with you based on respect and trust and the knowledge that we chose each other freely." Evelyn's voice shook but held steady as she made her own promises. "I promise to be your equal in this partnership, to work alongside you, to challenge you when needed, to support you always, to honor what we've survived and what we're building together, and to choose you every day for as long as we both live." When they kissed to seal the marriage, applause erupted from their small gathering of friends, but Evelyn barely heard it. She was too focused on the feeling of Dawson's arms around her, solid and safe, and the knowledge that this time she'd chosen right. This time, marriage meant partnership. This time, she was free. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, and when Evelyn climbed the stairs to what had been her room alone, Dawson followed. They talked about this, planned for it, made sure they were both ready, and when he touched her, it was with the gentle reverence of someone who understood that intimacy required trust, that bodies carried memories of pain as well as pleasure, that healing happened in increments. "Tell me if you need me to stop," he murmured against her hair. "We go at your pace, always." But Evelyn didn't need him to stop. She needed him to continue, to show her that touch could be kind, that desire could be mutual, that she could reclaim this part of herself too. And slowly, carefully, with infinite patience and care, he did. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that had once belonged to Sarah but now belonged to both of them, creating new memories to layer over the old. Through the window, stars shone bright and close, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "Are you happy?" Dawson asked quietly. Evelyn considered the question. Happy seemed too small a word for what she felt: grateful, hopeful, content, at peace. But it was also accurate in its simplicity. "Yes," she said. "I am. Are you?" "More than I thought I'd ever be again." He pulled her closer. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on this place, on us. Thank you for offering me a choice when I didn't think I had any." Evelyn pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "For seeing me as a person worth saving." "You saved yourself," Dawson corrected gently. "I just gave you a safe place to do it." 2 years later, Evelyn gave birth to a daughter they named Hope Sarah Dawson. Hope for the future they were building, Sarah to honor the woman who'd come before. The birth was difficult, and there were moments when Evelyn understood viscerally what Sarah must have felt, the fear and pain and desperate determination. But she survived, and the baby survived, and when Dawson held his daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his weathered face, Evelyn knew that healing really was possible, that new life could grow from old grief. They raised Hope together on the ranch, teaching her to ride and shoot and stand her ground. They taught her that worth wasn't determined by gender or circumstances of birth, that strength came in many forms, and that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect and shared work. They taught her by example what love looked like when it was healthy and whole. The ranch prospered. They expanded the herd, improved the land, built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Evelyn kept the books with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd applied to the journal, and her business sense proved as valuable as Dawson's ranching knowledge. Together they made decisions, solved problems, weathered setbacks, and celebrated successes. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when Hope was asleep and the work was done, they'd sit on the porch like they had that very first night, watching the stars come out over the mountains and marveling at how far they'd come. From broken people with nothing to lose to partners building something worth protecting. From survival to life. From fear to freedom. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Evelyn asked one such evening, her hand in Dawson's. "When you offered me work without even knowing me?" "All the time," he admitted. "Best decision I ever made." "Even with all the trouble that came with it? Tom, the hearing, all of it?" "Especially because of that. We were both tested, and we both proved what we were made of. Can't build a solid foundation on easy ground." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, you were worth the trouble. Worth everything." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sage and pine and home. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived here, beaten, terrified, certain she had no value beyond what men decided to assign her. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, capable, valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. A woman who'd survived the worst and built the best from its ashes. The journey from that stagecoach to this porch had been brutal, but it had also been necessary because it had brought her here to this moment, this life, this love that was built on choice and sustained by partnership. She'd been broken when she arrived at the